Welcome back to World Religions. In this video, we're going to give an introduction to the religion of Islam. In section 11.1, we're going to overview the theology and other beliefs of Islam. Muslims believe in one God. They typically call God Allah, which is the Arabic word for God. In Islam, Iman refers to the system of belief in Islam, which is based on the Quran, a revelation of God to the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims speak of Tawheed, or the oneness, the unity of God. They do not believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, for example, unlike Christians who believe in one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Muslims deny the doctrine of the Trinity, like as well Jews, for example. In the Quran, in Surah or chapter 112, it says, quote, "Say, He is God the One, God the Eternal. He fathered no one, nor was he fathered. No one is comparable to him," unquote. You can see from this passage from the Quran, not only does it specifically say that God is one and eternal, it says God fathered no one, nor was he fathered. That is a direct denial of Christians' understanding of the role of Jesus as the Son of God, and as God as having both the Father and the Son as two of the persons of the Trinity. They do talk about multiple attributes of God in Islam. Muslims think of God as supreme, eternal, omnipotent, which means all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent, creator and sustainer of the universe, who controls life and death for all creatures. According to the Hadith, or the records of the custom of Muhammad, God has 99 names, which represent his various attributes and aspects. Some examples of these are Ar-Rahman, which means the beneficent in Arabic, or the one who does good. Ar-Rahim, which means the merciful. Al-Malik, which means the king or the Lord. Al-Qudus, which means the holy or the sacred. And As-Salam, which means the peaceful. Those are just some common examples. The picture on the slide is Arabic calligraphy that says Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. This is a way of saying God, the glory of God should be glorified. There is a custom in Islam of not depicting God or of the Prophet or other beings who might be worshipped as if they were icons or idols. So it's considered a great sin to make images of God. Rather, in Islam, it's common to have highly beautiful writing, Arabic calligraphy, with the name of God or one of his attributes. The Quran is the holy book or sacred scripture of Islam. Muslims believe the Quran is the supreme revelation of God's word. They believe the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, who lived from 570 to 632 AD, over a period of 23 years. Muslims also believe the Quran is extracted from a tablet on which God's word is kept in heaven. In Sunni Islam, which is the majority sect, it's believed traditionally that the Quran is co-eternal with God. This was the opinion of the Sunni scholar Abu Hanifa, who lived from 699 to 767. Quote, "He who says that the word of God is created is an infidel," unquote. In other words, many Muslims believe that the Quran did not just come into being when it was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, but rather that the words of the Quran existed from all time. In Islam, the Quran is revered. Physical copies of the Quran are handled and stored with care. Reading the Quran is believed to bring a person closer to God with each word that is read, and many Muslims believe that pages of the Quran have healing properties. In Islam, the term Hafiz refers to someone who has memorized the entire Quran. This is regarded as an act of great piety and is highly respected. The picture on the slide is of Muslim children learning the Quran in their school. Muslims believe that God, Allah, has sent many prophets and messengers to humans. The word Nabi in Arabic means prophet. The words of a prophet are believed to come from God. Prophets are believed to be free from sin and to have the ability to perform miracles. The Hadith, or the traditional record of the custom of Muhammad, refers to 124,000 prophets, of which 313 were messengers or Rasul. Messengers or Rasul are given a new set of divine laws and a new revealed book. The Quran names only around 25 messengers. The other prophets who are not messengers are sent to transmit and implement the previously revealed scriptures. The Quran mentions that prophets, who are labeled as guides and warners, have come to, quote, every nation, unquote. So Muslims accept in principle that founders of other religions might also have been prophets sent by God in their own time and place. The picture on the slide shows the prophet Muhammad on the left with his face whited out, and the angel of revelation, Jibril or Gabriel, on the right. This is depicting the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad by Jibril. Many Muslims regard it as sacrilege or a great sin to depict the Prophet Muhammad. This is, I believe, a traditional Persian manuscript. At least it has the style of traditional Persian manuscripts. There has been variation in Islam in exactly what the interpretation is of what you can depict. Some Muslims have believed it is permissible to depict Muhammad as long as his face is not shown. Others would disagree and say any depiction at all is not permissible. Nevertheless, I will be using some images from the history of Islam that are of Muslim origin to help illustrate some of the core teachings and beliefs in Islam. For example, you can see that the depiction of Jibril the angel is similar to how such a being might be depicted or imagined in other Abrahamic religions like Judaism and Christianity. In this case, it's of a human figure with 4 wings. Ibn Khaldun, who lived from 1332 to 1406, had this to say about prophets and messengers. Quote, Allah has chosen individuals from among humankind whom he has honored by himself, speaking to them to mold them according to his understanding, and to make them the mediators between himself and his servants, unquote. There are a lot of overlaps, but also some differences between the Quran and the view of prophets in the Bible. Roughly, we can use that to refer to the Jewish and the Christian scriptures, respectively. Many of the prophets named in the Quran do have counterparts in the Bible, including Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, David, Solomon, Job, Joseph, Moses, and Aaron. For example, see Quran Surah 6, verse 84. However, some prophets named in the Quran do not have counterparts in the Bible, such as Hud, Salih, and Luqman. Muslims believe these in particular were prophets sent to the Arabs, and that's partly why they didn't appear in the Jewish Bible or in the Christian New Testament. Muslims all believe that Muhammad is the last and greatest of the prophets. So they regard themselves as worshiping the same God as Jews and Christians, and as having largely the same lineage of prophets going back to Old Testament or Hebrew Bible prophets such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they believe that Muhammad was the last and greatest of the prophets. That is a distinct belief of Muslims that is not shared by Jews and Christians. Muslims believe Muhammad was given 5 things not given to other prophets. 1. Divine assistance in achieving victory in battle, for example. 2. Right of prayer for his followers anywhere in the world. 3. Right to take booty after battle. Muhammad was a warlord who fought against his opponents and often enslaved the captives. 4. A mission to all humankind, not just, for example, to the Jews or to the descendants of Abraham. 5. Right of intercession on the day of judgment. Muslims do believe that there were other revelations apart from the Quran. So that corresponds to the idea of the messenger. For example, Moses was given the Torah, or the books of the law. David was given the Psalms. And Jesus was given the gospel. But the Quran does accuse Jews and Christians of corrupting these earlier revelations by changing the text or willfully misinterpreting it. So Muslims don't believe that the Hebrew Bible, the Bible used by the Jews, the Tanakh, or the Christian Bible, including the Old Testament and the Christian New Testament, they believe those are corrupted versions of the original revelation, not the uncorrupted original version. The Quran also presents itself as the final perfect revelation, which takes precedence over those that came before. The picture on the slide is of a Muslim depiction of the Annunciation, which was when the angel Gabriel, or Jibril in Arabic, shown on the right, announced the incarnation of Jesus to his mother Mary, or Miriam, shown on the left. Muslims also believe in angels. The Quran says that angels are created from light, and that there are so many angels that only God knows their number. Angels have no offspring, are neither male nor female, and they serve God. The Muslim scholar al-Tabari, who lived from 839 to 923, defined angels as follows, quote, God's messengers between him and his prophets, and those of his servants to whom they are sent, unquote. Other tasks of angels in Muslim belief include uttering continuous praise of God, bearing God's throne, accompanying believers in prayer, and recording the deeds of every person. The picture on the slide shows the Prophet Muhammad being accompanied by many angels. Muslims believe Jibril is the angel who transmitted the Quran to Muhammad. Jibril is the Arabic version of Gabriel, one of the angels mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Muslims also regard Jibril as the Holy Spirit, quote unquote. They believe that Jibril is the same as the angel who told Maryam, or Mary, of the coming birth of her son, Isa, or Jesus. So Muslims do regard Jesus, whom they call Isa in Arabic, to be a prophet and the Messiah, but unlike Christians, they don't believe in the divinity, death, or resurrection of Jesus, and they don't believe he was the Son of God or God. Muslims also believe in the angel Israel, or Azrael in Hebrew, who is the angel of death who draws out the souls of the dying, and in Israfil, or Raphael, the angel who sounds the trumpet on the last day. In other words, there's considerable overlap between the names and the overall beliefs of the nature of the angels in Islam and in Judaism and Christianity. Muslims believe that other angels guard hell and direct its affairs, and that opposing the angels amounts to opposing God, as it says in the Quran, Surah 2, verse 98. Finally, Muslims believe in the resurrection of the dead and a final day of judgment for all humans. Many messages from God are believed to warn humans of the day of resurrection and of judgment, but the exact time of the day of judgment is known only to Allah. However, it is known that it will be on a Friday, the 10th day of the month of Muharram. The Hadith gives signs of the approach of the day of judgment, such as an increase in sin, widespread disobedience of parents and disrespect for elders, an increase in debauchery, an increase in the numbers of women relative to men, and with incompetent people of low status assuming positions of leadership. It's believed that everyone will be judged according to their repentance and the degree to which they have followed God's law, which in Islam is called Sharia. Everyone's deeds will also be weighed on scales. Those who are unbelievers when they died or who have not repented of their sins before death will be punished. So the two possible outcomes for souls are heaven and hell. This is similar to the Christian and the traditional Jewish view of the afterlife. Heaven is called Jannah in Arabic. It's the reward for good deeds, right belief, and sincere repentance. It's depicted as a place of eternal bliss, like a garden with rivers, carpets, cushions, fruit, and also, this is distinctive of Islam, there are virgins or maidens called huris, who men will be able to enjoy in carnal relations for eternity. The picture on the slide, by the way, on the right, shows Muhammad in his night journey or mystical journey, where he was given visions of different parts of the universe. In this picture, he is viewing the torments of the wicked souls in hell. Hell is called Jahannam in Arabic. This is basically the Arabic version of Gehenna. Hell is a place of punishment for bad deeds, unbelief, and lack of repentance. It's a place of eternal torment with fire and boiling water. The skin will be scalded and then renewed and scalded again. And the damned are forced to eat the bad fruit of the tree of Zakum, which is shown on the picture on the slide. Muslims also believe in predestination in the sense that everything is decreed by God. God controls everything that happens to everyone. So that suffices for a survey of the beliefs of Islam. Now we're going to talk about the Prophet Muhammad, his life, the origin historically of Islam, and its early history under the leadership of the Prophet. Muhammad was born in Arabia around the year 570, so the 6th century AD. Most Arabs at the time were members of nomadic tribes. There was a kingdom in the north, that of Nabatea, that was quite powerful and prosperous, controlling some of the trade. There were also some cities, especially in the western side of Arabia, like Yathrib and Sana'a, and the smaller town of Mecca as well. These were on an overland camel caravan trade route, which carried trade between southern Arabia and northern Arabia. The northern Arabian kingdoms, such as Nabatea, traded with the Romans and the Mediterranean to the north. In terms of the camel caravan route, a lot of what they carried was incense, like frankincense, that was grown in southwestern Arabia. There was also probably an even more active sea route that led along the Red Sea and stopped at some of the ports on the western coast of Arabia. That connected the Mediterranean Sea in the north and west with the Indian Ocean in the east. The religion of ancient Arabia was polytheistic. Many Arabs believed that fate or time determined what happened to them, and they believed in a variety of gods and goddesses, such as the goddess Alat. There also appears to have been a somewhat widespread belief in a high god who would be called Allah, or the god, ruling over the others as kind of a king. The other gods were also sometimes regarded as angels who could be asked to intercede with the supreme God. Judaism and Christianity were also found in ancient Arabia. There were Jewish communities in Yathrib and in some other areas in Western Arabia, and some Arab tribes had become Christian as well. Islam began in the town of Mecca, a small city on the camel caravan route in Western Arabia. The camel caravan route was part of the trade network between the Indian Ocean in the east and the Mediterranean Sea in the northwest. The growing wealth of Mecca led to some of the social tensions that were present at the time of Muhammad. Some of these connected to the Kaaba, the sanctuary in Mecca, which was an ancient center of pilgrimage. There was a stone in the center of the Kaaba or cube shrine that was believed to have fallen from heaven. The Quraysh were the tribe that largely controlled Mecca in the time of Muhammad. Muhammad lived from around 570 to 632 AD. He was born in Mecca. His parents died when he was young, so he was raised by his uncle and then his grandfather. At the age of 25, he married his employer, a wealthy widow, 40 years of age, named Khadija. She lived from around 554 or 567 AD to 619 AD. Muhammad began to receive revelations from God or Allah around the year 610 when he was praying in the cave of Hira on the mountain Jabal al-Nur. Muhammad received revelations from God for over 23 years. The Quran is believed by Muslims to be the collection of all the revelations to Muhammad. Muhammad believed the revelations were given to him by an angel of God, Jibril or Gabriel. The revelations speak of Muhammad himself as a warner and as a prophet or messenger of God. The main teachings that were revealed to Muhammad is that there's only one God, Allah, that God is merciful and all-powerful, that there will be a last day, a day of judgment, in which God will judge people according to their acts and assign them to heaven or hell, and that the Quran itself was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad from God. It was not something authored by Muhammad. After his first revelation in the cave, Muhammad was initially terrified and ran back home and sought his wife's comfort. She, Khadija, became the first believer, the first to believe that the revelation was from God, and she became a follower of Muhammad. She gave him moral and financial support as he spread the message of Islam. She had essentially inherited a caravan business from her first husband, and that was the basis for her wealth. It was also what Muhammad worked in before they married. He was, I believe, a drover of some of her animals in the caravan. So she was an early pillar of support for Muhammad. Muhammad gained many followers in Mecca, but many of the merchants there opposed him. The merchants were mostly polytheistic, worshiping many gods, and they also profited from all the pilgrims going to the Kaaba, which was a shrine that had idols to many different gods in it. So they might have feared that if Muhammad's new religion took off, that their shrine might be destroyed or done away with. In the event, the Kaaba became the holiest place in Islam because it was regarded by Muhammad and his followers as having been created by the biblical patriarch Abraham and his son Ishmael. The Quran began to include revelations telling of former prophets whose opponents were destroyed, such as the prophets Noah, Lot, and Moses. This could be interpreted as a response to the opposition that Muhammad was getting early on in Mecca. Muhammad married other women after the death of his first wife Khadija in 619. In total, he had 11 wives, which was more than the 4 maximum that are ordinarily permitted to Muslim men. A lot of these marriages were political alliances with other families, and also before he married Aisha, his third and youngest wife, and for his other wives after, Muhammad mostly married widows or people who were already married and with children. So he was often kind of like adopting widows and their children by marrying them. So Aisha became Muhammad's favorite wife as well. The picture on the slide shows Muhammad preaching to the Meccans to abandon their old lunar calendar. This is an example of something that he taught that would have aroused opposition in Mecca. Eventually, Muhammad and his followers were outright persecuted by their enemies in Mecca, including by some members of their own families. As a consequence, some of the Muslims migrated to the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia or Ethiopia in eastern Africa. Later, these eventually joined the Muslims who had migrated to Medina. The migration to Yathrib or Medina is called the Hijra in Islam. This happened in the year 622 when 70 Muslim men and their families migrated to the larger city of Yathrib to the north, and they were eventually followed by Muhammad himself. This Hijra marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar or the Muslim reckoning of years. Yathrib came to be called Medina or city. That's short for Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, as it was renamed after Muhammad settled there. It was an oasis town on that camel caravan trade route. The people in Yathrib initially invited Muhammad to help overcome some internal disputes they were having. There were local Jewish clans in Yathrib who awaited their Messiah, and they may have caused other Arabs to be willing to accept Muhammad as a judge or negotiator. Initially, it appears that there was good relations between Muhammad and at least some of the Jewish clans in Yathrib because they were fellow monotheists, perhaps, but eventually their relations soured. One faction in Medina supported Muhammad and wanted to form a single community with the Muslims. The picture on the slide is of the Masjid-e-Nabawi, or the Mosque of the Prophet in Yathrib. The Muslim community in Medina started to take shape in that their distinctive practices came into use of daily prayer, almsgiving, fasting during the month of Ramadan, pilgrimage to Mecca. There were also legal revelations to Muhammad in the Quran on, for example, inheritance and avoiding incense, which helped govern the new Muslim community in Medina. The Jewish clans in Medina initially allied with Muhammad and the Muslims, but they refused to accept Muhammad as a genuine prophet and mocked parts of the Quran. Eventually, Muhammad expelled 2 of the Jewish clans from Medina and then executed the men of the 3rd clan, enslaving their women and children. There were also some battles in which the Muslims attacked caravans to try to raid them. This was a common part of the culture of ancient Arabia, in which tribes would raid the other tribes or raid merchants' caravans and try to loot them. And warlords were expected to lead their followers in battle and provide loot or booty for them to share among themselves. Muhammad adopted the role of a warlord around this time. They initially had at least one failed raid, but eventually started to build up military successes. In 624, the Muslims fought the Battle of Badr, in which they defeated the Quraysh. This was their first great victory. In the year 625, they fought the Battle of Uhud, in which they were defeated by the Quraysh. But then in the year 627, they fought the Battle of the Trench, which happened when the Quraysh led a large army, including some allies, against Medina. Their goal was to finally end Muhammad as a threat, but Muhammad was advised to dig a trench on the unprotected part of the city, the part that wasn't protected by mountains. And this proved decisive. It helped the Muslims gain victory over the alliance of the Quraysh, and it essentially destroyed the military power of the Quraysh and Mecca after that. Muhammad, after the victory of the Battle of the Trench, was able to conquer Mecca a few years later in the year 630. He led an army there, and the city mostly just didn't resist and surrendered. Most Meccans became Muslim at that time. Eventually, Muhammad was able to conquer and ally with tribes in Western Arabia and in some other parts of Arabia as well. And the allied tribes were later forced to convert to Islam. During this whole time of expansion and victories in battle and politics, Muhammad was the head of both the religion of Islam and the head of state, the head of government. These dual roles were inherited by his successors, the caliphs, after his death. You can see the picture on the slide, the early expansion of Islam in the green areas in the Arabian Peninsula rather, and also the two main early rival empires to the Muslims. The Byzantine or East Roman Empire to the north and west of Arabia, and the Persian or Sassanid Empire to the north and east of Arabia. The Sassanid Empire was conquered very swiftly after the death of Muhammad, as were parts of the Byzantine or East Roman Empire as well. Now we're going to talk about the Caliphate, or what happened in the Muslim community after the death of Muhammad. Muhammad died in the year 632, and his successors were known as caliphs or khalifa. This means successor or deputy of Muhammad. The first four caliphs after Muhammad form what is known by Sunni Muslims as the Rashidun Caliphate, or the rightly guided caliphs. They ruled collectively between 632 and 661. Muhammad's immediate successor was Abu Bakr, who ruled the Muslims from 632 to 634. He had been the closest companion of Muhammad. He was Muhammad's father-in-law through his daughter Aisha, and he in turn designated Umar as his successor. Umar ruled from 634 to 644. He was another father-in-law of Muhammad through his daughter Hafsa. He was assassinated by a Persian slave. This was after the Muslim conquest of Persia, and some Persians continued to resist Muslim rule, including the one who assassinated Umar. He is viewed very negatively by Shia Muslims, about whom more later. Umar's successor was Uthman, who ruled from 644 to 656. He was elected by a committee of 6 men chosen by Umar on his deathbed to elect the successor. Uthman was the son-in-law of Muhammad. He was eventually assassinated by rebels who had accused him of nepotism, primarily promoting his own clan members to positions of power and authority in the Muslim empire rather than older Muslim companions of Muhammad. Uthman was succeeded by Ali, who ruled from 656 to 661. Ali was the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima. He's considered the first imam or spiritual leader by Shia Muslims. He was eventually assassinated by a Kharijite Muslim. The Kharijites were originally allies of Ali and enemies of his enemies, the Umayyad clan under Muawiyah, but they eventually became enemies of Ali because Ali concluded a peace treaty with the Umayyads, and that was considered inappropriate by the Kharijites. They wanted him to keep fighting this other rebel clan, the Umayyads. And Ali eventually fought the Kharijites, defeated them in battle, but he was assassinated by a Kharijite in revenge for Ali turning against them and defeating them. During the time of the Rashidun Caliphate and after, Islam gradually expanded across large areas of North Africa, Asia, and eventually into Europe as well. The raiding and conquest of the Muslims had started under Muhammad. As mentioned previously, nomadic Arab tribes routinely raided their neighbors for livestock and other booty. Muhammad had led the Arab Muslims on raids or ghazawat in Arabia. The first caliphs organized raids into Syria and Iraq. Those were parts of the Eastern Roman and the Sassanid Persian empires. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid or Sasanian Empire had been enemies themselves for centuries, and recently, around the time of Muhammad, had fought themselves to exhaustion, which made them ripe for plunder and conquest when the Muslims came to power. They kind of filled the power vacuum that remained as a result of these two older and kind of strategically exhausted empires. Within 12 years of Muhammad's death, Muslim armies had conquered Egypt and Syria and Iraq and were advancing into Cyrenaica, in what's now Libya, and into Persia. Muslim pirates also raided throughout the Mediterranean Sea, including into Western and Southern Europe. The Pact of Umar was an important point in the history of Islam and its relations to Christians and Jews. Muslims made treaties with groups of conquered Christians and Jews, and they were essentially treated as dhimmis, or people of the book. They were so called because they had their own Bible or scripture. They were permitted by the Muslims to keep their religion, but had to pay a special tax called jizya, which was higher than that paid by Muslims. The Muslim tax was the zakah, which was used in part for charitable contributions. Although the Muslims paid a lower tax in currency or in kind to the government, they also owed military service. The Muslim concept of jihad is also relevant to the Muslim territorial expansion. Jihad means striving, and it can be defined most simply as holy war. It's defined in the Sharia or Muslim law as armed struggle against unbelievers, i.e. against non-Muslims. Early on in the history of Islam, there were Arab tribes that were forced to convert to Islam after they had been conquered. When the Sassanid or Persian Empire was conquered, the Persians, who were mostly Zoroastrians in religion, were rapidly converted to Islam in the 7th century. Muslim wars, however, were not always or even often connected with forced conversions to their religion. The wars were usually raids for booty, i.e. to get treasure, captive humans that were sold into slavery, or livestock. They weren't usually making war for the purpose of conversion. But most of the conquered peoples were given dhimmi status because they were Jews, Christians, or other types of monotheists. Over the centuries, however, most of the dhimmis gradually converted to Islam. There was cultural pressure because they were in societies dominated by Muslims, but also there were financial incentives to avoid the jizya. So Egypt, which was majority Christian when it was conquered by the Muslims, had a very large Christian population, but it became more and more Muslim over the centuries until at some point it became majority Muslim and minority Christian as it is today. And in fact, the Christian community in Egypt is in a somewhat precarious circumstance. But there was kind of a similar gradual shift to majority Muslim in many of the provinces that the Muslims had conquered from the Eastern Roman Empire. The conversion of Persia from Zoroastrianism and some other faiths to Islam was much more rapid, however. After the Rashidun Caliphate was the Umayyad Caliphate, which ruled from 661 to 750. It was founded by Muawiyah. He was the member of the Umayyad clan who previously had rebelled against Ali. He ruled all of the Muslim world as a single empire. The capital was moved from Arabia to Damascus in Syria. It was essentially a more central capital in terms of the political and military arrangements that were then part of the Muslim Caliphate. It was more efficient politically and militarily to have the capital further to the north. The Muslims continued to expand during this period. They conquered the rest of North Africa and Spain. They expanded into Afghanistan, Central Asia, and passed the Indus River into India. Their expansion into Western Europe was stopped in France at the Battle of Tours in the year 732, when a Muslim army was defeated by Franks under Charles Martel. This ended the period of Muslim expansion into Western Europe, but they still retained the conquest of Spain. And Muslim armies, although they did not yet succeed at conquering the remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, which at that time had been reduced to Greece, Anatolia, and Southeast Europe, or the Balkan Peninsula, they did raid the capital of Constantinople. And several centuries later, there were Turkish Muslims, the Ottomans, who succeeded in conquering Constantinople and finally bringing the Eastern Roman Empire to an end. After the Umayyads, the next caliphate were the Abbasids, who ruled from 750 to 1258. They moved the capital to Baghdad in Iraq, so that's in Mesopotamia, east of Damascus. They never ruled Spain, which at this time broke off into a separate Muslim dynasty. This began the political disintegration of Islam, although early in their period, the Abbasids still ruled the majority of Muslims. During the Abbasid Caliphate, there was a great flowering of Sharia, or Islamic law. Sharia was derived from the Quran, but also from the Hadith. Hadith, or traditions, are the collections of stories about the deeds and sayings of Muhammad, which are regarded as authoritative for Muslim conduct. Sharia became the core of Islamic scholarship and learning and higher education. Muslim scholarship included, in addition to Sharia, textual study of the Quran, interpretation of the Quran, Arabic grammar and lexicology, or theory of the words of Arabic, and theology. Muslim scholars also studied the so-called foreign sciences, largely Greek, but also translated from other Middle Eastern languages like Syriac. These included philosophy, medicine, math, and natural science. Greek philosophy and so on was translated into Arabic at this time, and they wrote a lot of commentaries that were later influential on Western European philosophy. Some of that Arabic scholarship later made it to Europe, in part through the Muslim Kingdom of Spain. Eventually, the Abbasid caliphs fell into decline. They lost control of their outlying provinces. Some local governors who had their own powerful armies would choose their own successors. This essentially disrupted the authority of the caliph in their area, and so they ended up founding their own dynasties. Eventually, the Abbasid caliphs lost control over Baghdad itself and the core provinces. The caliphate was put to an end in 1258 when the Mongols invaded and conquered the city of Baghdad. The expansion of Islam slowed after the year 750, but it continued for centuries after, essentially up until modern times, where it's still expanding into parts of Africa, for example. In Africa, the Muslim camel caravan traders brought Islam to West Africa. These were trade routes across the Sahara Desert. Muslim sea merchants, meanwhile, brought Islam to Eastern Africa along the trade routes there. In Asia, Islam spread by trade from India to the East Indies, what's now Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and also into Central Asia and China along the Silk Road. India was conquered by Muslim Turks and Afghans and ruled by a Muslim dynasty called the Delhi Sultanate from 1206 to 1526. This was actually a series of different dynasties, but they all used Delhi as their capital. The Mughal dynasty ruled India from 1556 to 1707. It was another Muslim dynasty and was named after the Mongols. The people who ruled it were of Central Asian ancestry, although they were Muslim, unlike the Mongols, most of whom were Buddhist. The Hindus in India were treated as dhimmis, or people of the book, because their philosophers were regarded as monotheistic. Um, there were probably a couple of practical reasons for this. Strictly speaking, they probably were supposed under Islamic law and tradition to have been forcibly converted to Islam because they were essentially pagans or polytheistic. But that would have been very difficult, first of all. And then secondly, it would have lowered the amount that they could be taxed by the rulers. This shows you, by the way, that the existence of the dhimmi, or people of the book status, was often something that rulers prized because it enabled them to tax some of their subjects at a higher rate than their Muslim subjects. In India, there were some large-scale conversions to Islam, but the majority of the Indian subcontinent remained Hindu. Spain was gradually reconquered from the Muslims over a period of several centuries. The reconquest is called Reconquista in Spanish, and it was affected by several different Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain. It culminated with the conquest of Granada in the southern tip of Spain in 1492, which had been the last remaining Muslim kingdom there. Muslims were completely driven out of Spain by the proclamation of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella and by the action of the Spanish Inquisition. Ferdinand and Isabella declared that all Muslims and Jews had to either convert to Catholic Christianity or leave Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was a Christian court that had jurisdiction only over Christians, technically, not over Muslims or Jews, but they did interrogate Muslims that were suspected of not having been sincere converts to Christianity. And those two actions of the expulsion and then the later activity of a Spanish Inquisition effectively ended the existence of Islam in Spain up until modern times, where it was reintroduced largely by migrants from North Africa. In the east of Europe, the Ottoman Turks, who were originally a Central Asian nomadic people, but eventually converted to Islam, they eventually conquered the lands of the Caliphate, or the former Caliphate, and created a powerful and expanding empire, pushing deep into southeastern Europe, as you can see from the map on the slide. They eventually ruled most of the Muslim core lands, not all of Arabia, but the western strip of Arabia that included the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and most of the other areas that had previously been ruled by the Rashidun, Umayyad, and Abbasid caliphates, at least in terms of the core, like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and North Africa. The 1400s was the age of discovery from the European perspective. The Portuguese and other powers, including the Spanish and the Dutch and others, sent sailors and explorers around the world. They were mainly interested in discovering trade routes to South and East Asia. The Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, and reached India in 1498. This led to increasing European trade with India that disrupted the ancient trade network between the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean, which had been controlled by Muslims for centuries and was one of the main sources of their wealth and power. Europeans continued to develop commercially, intellectually, and technology in the 14 to the 1700s. For a long time, the Ottoman Turks were at the same level as the Europeans in terms of military technology, or sometimes even higher. But European military technology eventually surpassed that of the Ottomans in the 17th and 18th century. The Ottoman expansion into Europe was halted at the Siege of Vienna in the 1600s, and they began a steady decline thereafter. European powers also established small colonies and trading posts in Africa and Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, some European powers began taking over Muslim lands. Very few Muslims converted to Christianity during the period of European imperialism and colonialism. Apart from the remnant of the Ottoman Empire, most Muslim lands were ruled by Europeans by the early 20th century, although they would gain their independence shortly thereafter. Now we're going to talk about the main sects or divisions within Islam. The majority of Muslims, around 85%, belong to Sunni Islam. Sunni Muslims regard Muhammad as the seal of the prophets, and that his successor is merely a guardian of his prophetic legacy. They believe the Caliph is the leader chosen by the consensus or ijma of the community ummah of believers. The Caliph must come from the male members of the Quraysh tribe to which Muhammad belonged, but otherwise don't have to be, for example, direct relatives or family members of Muhammad. Sunni Islam is named after Sunnah or custom. This is the authoritative conduct of Muhammad and of the Rashidun, the four rightly guided caliphs. Sunni Muslims believe in Sharia as being the law for the Muslim community, but they put emphasis on the consensus or ijma of legal scholars. In other words, unlike Shia Muslims, they don't regard particular figures as having a continual spiritual authority after that of Muhammad that is in some way comparable to the authority of a prophet. The Caliphate became a dynasty and was responsible for guarding the Sharia law. The Caliphate continued under the Ottoman Turks, but was eventually abolished in 1924 with the end of the Ottoman Caliphate. And this notion of the Caliphate is significant because the Muslim rulers essentially regarded themselves in the Sunni tradition as protectors, guardians of the Sharia. There was no particular person like a Shia imam or spiritual leader that would have that authority, but rather the whole consensus of the community of scholars as protected and supported by the Caliph. Shia Islam comes from the Arabic word Shia, which means sect. So around 15% of Muslims are part of Shia Islam or are Shiite Muslims. Muhammad, according to Shia Muslims, completed the cycle of prophethood, but after Muhammad instituted the cycle of initiation for the continued guidance of the community. So the Shia Muslims consider themselves the people of appointment and identification, that there are particular individuals who are the spiritual successors of Muhammad, and those essentially have a lineage of initiation that continues in some sense up until the present day. Shia Muslims believe that Muhammad appointed his successor as Imam, who is the principal religious authority over Muslims. And Shia Muslims believe that the Imam has a divinely inspired and infallible interpretation of the Quran. So this is a huge difference between them and the Sunni Muslims, who don't believe any scholar of Sharia has that type of inspired and infallible interpretation. Shia Muslims believe that the cycle of wilayah will continue until the end of human history, when on the last day humans will be resurrected and judged. Shia Muslims believe that the first Imam was Ali, the cousin, adopted son, and later a son-in-law of Muhammad, by his marriage to Muhammad's daughter Fatima. Shia Muslims believe that Ali inherited the wilayah or spiritual abilities of Muhammad. The succession of imams is through Ali's sons, with Fatima and their descendants. That's a belief shared by all Shia Muslims. Hassan and Hussein were the two sons of Ali and Fatima. Ali and Hussein were both martyrs for Islam. Ali was assassinated by the Kharijites, as mentioned previously, who were enemies of Muawiyah and the Umayyads, just as Ali himself had been before, but they turned on Ali because they thought he was not harsh enough or thoroughgoing enough in his opposition to the rebellion of Muawiyah. Hussein was later killed at the Battle of Karbala in Iraq. This was fought in the year 680 between Hussein and Yazid I, who was the second caliph of the Umayyads. The picture on the slide is a Shia icon of the investiture of Ali, where he's getting the spiritual authority from Muhammad. There are several sects within Shia Islam itself. The Imamis make up the majority, around 85% of Shia Muslims. Most of them live in Iran. They're also known as the Ithna Ashari, or as Twelver Shia in English. They believe that the cycle of Wilaya will be completed with the return of the 12th Imam, who they refer to as the Imam of the period. So the 12th Imam was a figure who lived historically centuries ago, but Imami Shia believed that the 12th Imam withdrew into occultation, or a kind of spiritual hiding away, in the 3rd century of the history of Islam. The 12th Imam's guidance is believed to still be accessible, however, through the Mujtahidun, or doctors of the law, who are still alive. It's like the living generation of Shia scholars. The Zaidi sect of Shia Islam do not limit the number of Imams to 12, unlike the Imamis, and they interpret the role of the Imam as more similar to that of the Caliph in Sunni Islam. And then a third sect of Shia Muslims are the Ismailis. They have an esoteric doctrine about the Imam. There are different sects within the Ismailis. The Nazaris, for example, regard the Aga Khan as their Imam, and there is a current living Aga Khan. Esoteric, by the way, means a secret or hidden teaching which is known only to the few. The Mustalis, or Bora Muslims, in contrast, believe in a hidden Imam who is represented by their leader, whom they call the Dai. And lastly, we can talk about Sufism, which is technically not a sect of Islam, but rather a mystical tradition. Sufis seek intimacy with God through spiritual purification. The name Sufism is related to tasawwuf, which means self-purification. A Sufi is a person whose heart is purified of worldly pollution. There's also the term mutasawwif, or one who tries to be a Sufi. Muhammad is venerated by Muslims as a Sufi. It's believed that his heart was cleansed when he was a child. He also had a mystical journey called the Night Journey that included an ascension to heaven, or Miraj. This appeared in writings about the life of Muhammad. You can see the picture on the slide on the right showing Muhammad on the back of a mystical creature that he rode as he was ascending into heaven. And you can see a bunch of angelic beings that are depicted there. So this was a part of the Miraj portion of the Night Journey. He also had visions of hell and descended to Jerusalem as well before returning to Arabia. There's also an early group that may be connected to the origins of Sufism. They were called the People of the Bench, or Abul al-Sufa in Arabic. These are people who were early followers of Muhammad who constantly prayed and rarely left the mosque in Medina. They wore a simple tunic made of wool, or suf. They practiced asceticism, i.e. renouncing worldly things, and modeled themselves after Jesus, the son of Mary, Isa ibn Maryam in Arabic. Sufism emphasizes the love of God. This is related to the verse from the Quran in Surah 3, verse 76, quote, God loves the God-fearing, unquote. The Sufi view of love is that it obliterates from the heart everything except the beloved, i.e. God. Rabia al-Adawiya, who lived in the 8th century, said, quote, O beloved of my heart, I have none like unto thee. Therefore have pity this day on the sinner who comes to thee. O my hope and my rest and my delight, the heart can love none other than thee, unquote. So a lot of Sufi mystic poetry uses the language of love to express the soul's longing and self-emptying or self-denying or self-quenching, you might say, love of Allah. There's also the notion of the tariqah or spiritual path in Sufism, which is modeled after Muhammad's night journey. So it's thought of the mystical ascent of the soul to God. You can see the picture on the slide of some Sufis engaged in a kind of whirling dance-like activity. There are different practices used by different types of Sufis, but many of them involve rhythmic motions. This is a part of their zikr or perpetual memory or prayer of God. Sufis will generally have a master, a sheikh, or a pir. They insist that someone who wants to be a Sufi, a mutasawwif, must follow the guidance of a spiritual master rather than their own individual whim. There are a variety of different Sufi orders who have their own lineages of masters. Sufis also practice mujahadat or acts of self-mortification. The word comes from the Arabic word jihad for holy war or striving. The Quran says that Allah, quote, will surely guide those who strive hard for our cause, unquote. This is from Surah 29, verse 69. Muhammad explained that the highest level of jihad is the inward striving for self-purification. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about Islamic law or Sharia. But really, this is just a shorthand for the whole tradition of Muslim scholarship and sciences. Muslims believe in several types of revealed scriptures, and these are regarded as the basis for other scholarship. There are two main types of revealed scriptures, kutub and suhuf. Kutub or books are longer and suhuf or scrolls are shorter. It's believed by Muslims that there were more than 100 scriptures revealed to prophets such as Adam, Seth, Enoch, and Abraham, but are now lost. Only 4 of the revealed scriptures are believed by Muslims to have survived. The Taurat or Torah, which was revealed to Moses, the Zabur or Psalms, which were revealed to David, the Injil or Gospel, which was revealed to Jesus, and the Quran, which was revealed to Muhammad. The Quran is the last and the most definitive revelation, and it supplants all the earlier revelations, according to Muslims. Muslims believe that God sends his angels with revealed books to human messengers and prophets who then transmit them to other people. Let's talk a bit about the structure of the Quran. The Quran was revealed to Muhammad while he lived, but he did not write it down. He was actually illiterate. He memorized what was said to him and repeated it to others, and it was then memorized and recited by other Muslims. It was compiled after the death of Muhammad and written down into the standard form used today. The Quran is divided into 114 surah or chapters. Each surah has a number and a title. For example, the first is known as the opening, the second is known as the cow, and the third is known as the family of Imran. Each chapter or surah is divided into one or more verses, ayah. In total, the Quran has 6,000 346 verses. The surahs are often divided into those that were revealed to Muhammad at Mecca and those that were revealed to him at Medina. The Meccan surahs often criticize the city of Mecca as idolatrous, as socially unjust, etc. The Medinan surahs tend to address legal issues, the structure of the state or government of the Muslim community, and various interethnic and interreligious relations that existed at the time vis-a-vis the Muslims and other people in Medina and elsewhere. Muslims believe that the Quran governs all areas of life. The Quran does not separate religion or matters of theology from those of government or society, or the sacred from the secular. And it contains many types of teaching, such as moral rules and laws for the community, injunctions to fear and obey God, parables, allegorical stories that teach a lesson. There are chapters of encouragement for when the Muslims are facing dangers and challenges. There are the Muslim versions of stories relating to biblical figures and events, such as about the prophets Abraham, Ishmael, Jesus, and Mary as well. There's also different styles of writing or different tones, sarcasm, argumentation, response, mercy, and ruthlessness. And there is some biographical information about Muhammad in the Quran. So the history of the compilation and translation of the Quran is complicated. There are Muslim traditions of this, but there are also disputes among modern scholars about how reliable those traditions are. According to Muslim tradition, Abu Bakr created the first official collection of the Quran, and Abu Bakr was the first caliph after the death of Muhammad. There's also the Muslim tradition of the Uthman Codex, that there was a standard version of the Quran created under Uthman, the third caliph, and who made an official collection of the Quran in 649 or 650. It's also possible that the standardization happened a little later under a later caliph. We do know that there was some variation in the early written and or oral versions of the Quran before they were completely standardized. There are also the Qira'at, which are different readings of the Quran. So there were diverse oral traditions about the Quran circulating and some ambiguities in the text from the early form of the Arabic script, which didn't have all the same ways of writing consonants and vowels that removed those ambiguities that were later developed in the Arabic script. Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid, who died in 936, identified 7 different readings or qira'at of the Quran, which were then accepted as canonical. In other words, based on how you interpret some of the letters and the vowels, there can be variation in how you read the Quran even today among different Muslims. The role of translation in the Quran is somewhat complex. 3 out of the 4 Sunni schools of Islamic law insist that all prayer and liturgy from the Quran must be in the original Arabic. Only the Hanafite school allowed worshippers to recite the opening surah of the Quran in Persian, which was subsequently extended to other languages. As a consequence, translations of the Quran are not considered the Quran itself by Muslims, but rather as commentaries on it. Although in 20th century Turkey and Egypt, there was some additional acceptance of translations of the Quran. There's also the concept of abrogation. Some verses of the Quran appear to contradict each other. Abrogation is relevant to the Surah 2, verse 106 of the Quran, where the content of the Quran is contradictory. Later verses are believed to abrogate earlier verses. Muslims don't believe this proves the Quran was in error, but rather that the earlier verse was intended for a particular or earlier context, and the later verse for a broader or later context. Hence the need for an abrogation or a kind of new verse to take over from the old. An example is in Surah 2, Ayah 143, where the earlier teaching was to pray in the direction of Jerusalem, whereas in Surah 2, Ayah 144, it's clear the later teaching is to pray facing Mecca. So it's an example of a change in the practice of the Muslims that was a sort of deliberate choice, if you will, of God that's revealed to Muhammad in the Quran. The Hadith are the prophetic traditions. They record the life of Muhammad and also of his closest associates. There are two types of Hadith, Hadith Qudsi and Hadith Sharif. Hadith Qudsi include God's words mediated through Muhammad, as in the Quran, whereas the Hadith Sharif are Muhammad's own words and deeds. The scholar Al-Ghazali, who lived between 1058 and 1111, had the following to say, quote, God has but one word, which differs only in the mode of its expression. On occasions, God indicates his word by the Quran, on others by words in another style, not publicly recited and called the prophetic tradition. Both are mediated by the Prophet, unquote. So it's basically expressing the important status of the Hadith, even though they're not technically the Quran or the Revelation. The picture on the slide is of the earliest manuscript of the Muwatta, an important Hadith collection by Malik ibn Anas. Traditional Muslim education focuses on theology, i.e. what to believe, and Islamic law, how to act. However, Islamic law has always been more developed and explicit than Muslim theology. Sharia literally means the way to a watering place. Metaphorically, it's the path provided by God's commandments. There are four main sources of Sharia or Islamic law. Number one is the Quran. Number two is the Sunnah or the practice of the Prophet as recorded in the Hadith. Number three is the Ijma or consensus of the Muslim community or of its leading scholars. And number four is the Qiyas, analogical deductions from the first three sources that can be done by modern judges. Historically speaking, Sharia was also based on pre-Islamic customary and codified law and the administrative practices of the early Islamic state, as well as the customs of its various conquered territories. There are 5 categories of Sharia. Number 1, what God has commanded. Number 2, what God has recommended but not made strictly obligatory. Number 3, what God has left legally indifferent. Number 4, what God has deprecated but not actually prohibited. And then number 5, what God has expressly forbidden. Sharia covers every aspect of life. There are, including today, courts of Sharia law, and they are presided over by a qadi or judge. Much of Sharia is not enforced by human courts, but is believed to be enforced by God on the Day of Judgment. The Sharia courts have allowed devices, quote unquote, that ease the inconvenience of some of the precepts of Sharia. There are also less rigid courts that have existed alongside the official courts of the qadis. Despite these caveats, Sharia was still the basic and residual law of the Muslim world until the 19th century. And as we'll see, it still plays some role today as well. So there are several principles that come into play with interpreting Sharia. Ijtihad is the original ruling of a jurist or legal expert based on the sources of Sharia. Sharia was developed over many centuries by legal scholars who gave their own rulings. Later jurists generally only draw from the ijtihad of earlier jurists, rather than developing their own novel rulings. The concept of taqlid means conformity to the teaching of past jurists. Mujtahid is a recognized legal authority, but these vary in different sects of Islam. Each sect of Islam has its own school, or in many cases, multiple schools of Sharia. You can see from the map on the slide that Sunni Islam has four main schools of Sharia: Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi'i. So those are the so-called orthodox schools or rites of Sharia for Sunnis. The Ithna Ashari or Imami Shiites are a subsect of Shia dominant in Iran. They believe that mujtahidun may still exercise ijtihad in some cases, and that connects more broadly to the general Shiite notion of living spiritual authorities within the Muslim community. Ismaili Shias, meanwhile, believe that the Imam or his representative, the Dai Mutlaq, can exercise ijtihad. So now we're going to talk about the practices of Islam. First and foremost, Muslims believe in practicing Islam or submission to God. The word Muslim means one who submits to God's will. The Quran describes Abraham as neither a Jew nor a Christian, but as a Muslim, one who submitted to God. Muhammad and his followers actually referred to themselves as believers or al-mu'minun in the Quran. They later became known as Muslims, however. Muslims also talk about ibadah or worship. The Quran says, quote, "I created humankind only that they might worship me," unquote. They regard each person as an abid of God, or a servant and worshiper, and they believe that all areas of life are under God's command, and that every created thing exists in complete dependence upon God. So daily life is not separated clearly from worship in Islam. Daily life is referred to as muamalat, but religious devotion is thought to be combined with outward and inward, physical and spiritual dimensions, so it can pervade all of daily life. The Muslim scholar Al-Ghazali said, quote, "Public worship is 17 times better than private worship," unquote. This means that Islam doesn't prize a kind of separation between sincere inner devotion and outward manifestation, rather that the two can and should go together, so that one should worship publicly. The picture on the slide is of Bilal ibn Rabah, who was the first muezzin or Muslim to call other Muslims to prayer. You can see him in the picture standing on top of the Kaaba or cubical shrine, which is in Mecca. The central practices of Islam are called the 5 pillars of Islam. They are first, the Shahada or profession of faith. Second, Salah or prayer, which is 5 times daily. Third, Zakah or almsgiving. Fourth, Psalm or fasting during the month of Ramadan. And fifth, Hajj or pilgrimage. We'll talk about each of these in a bit more detail. The first of the 5 pillars is the Shahada or the profession of faith. An English translation of it is as follows, quote, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God," unquote. So it's the heart of the belief system of Islam. Muslims believe the Shahada should be the first words uttered into a child's ear after their birth, and the last words that a Muslim should utter with their dying breath. The Shahada asserts the unity or Tawheed of God and the role of Muhammad as the seal of the prophets. It's also used as the call to prayer of Muslims. The meaning of the Shahada is the heart of Muslim prayer. The picture on the slide is of an inscription of the Shahada above the Babu Salam Gate in Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey. The second of the 5 pillars is Salah or prayer. Worship in Islam is a communal act as well as an individual commitment. Muslims are expected to pray 5 times a day at specific fixed times. dawn, midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, and in the night. The Quran says, quote, "Proclaim thy Lord's praise before the rising of the sun and before its setting, and proclaim thy Lord's praise in the watches of the night and at the ends of the day," unquote. This is Surah 20, Ayah 130. Communal prayer is done on Fridays. This is the Friday Salah done at a mosque or masjid. It's usually led by an imam or prayer leader. The picture on the slide is from the Masjid-e-Nabawi, or the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina. The method of prayer involves several different steps. First, a ritual washing before the prayer itself. The Quran says, quote, "O believers, when you stand up to pray, wash your faces and your hands up to the elbows, and wipe your heads and your feet up to the ankles. If you are defiled, purify yourself," unquote. This is Surah 5, Ayah 8. Prayer is in the direction of Mecca. The muezzin gives the call to prayer for a Muslim community. Men and women assemble separately in rows, with each person close to the next. There is ritual bowing from standing to knees with the forehead to the floor. Prayers include Allahu Akbar, or God is greatest, and the first surah of the Quran. Worshippers pray together in sequence, quietly reciting words from the Quran. And then at the end of the prayer, each person says to others on their right and left, "Assalamu alaikum," which means peace be upon you. The third pillar of Islam is zakah, or almsgiving. Zakah, or zakat, is the duty to share wealth with the poor and needy. It's also believed that the inner attitude of giving is important. Inward zakah is purification of the soul and atones for the sins of selfishness or of irresponsible stewardship over possessions. Sharia contains detailed rules for the amounts of alms on different categories of possessions a person owes. Modern practice often simplifies the rule, however, to an annual rate of 2.5% of a person's cash balance. The fourth pillar of Islam is Swam, or fasting. Fasting involves total abstinence from both food and drink during the daylight hours during the holy month of Ramadan. Ramadan is a month-long festival that commemorates the first revelation of the Quran to Muhammad. It's the 9th month in the Muslim calendar. The night of power, or Laylat al-Qadr, is towards the end of the month of Ramadan. It commemorates the descent of the Quran from heaven and the beginning of Muhammad's ministry. There's also Eid al-Fitr, which is also known as Bayram. It marks the end of the month of Ramadan. On Eid al-Fitr, special alms are given. Fasting is to discipline the soul, but should be with an intention of thanksgiving. And it should be noted that Muslims can eat during the evenings of the month of Ramadan, and they often have large feasts during that month. As you can see from the picture on the slide, this in particular is to celebrate the festival of Eid al-Fitr, and the photo was taken in Tajikistan in the year 2007. The fifth pillar of Islam is Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca. This is to be fulfilled at least once in a lifetime for all Muslims, if possible. Dhu al-Hijjah is the 12th month of the Muslim calendar, and it forms the season of the Hajj, or the Great Pilgrimage. The Umrah, or Little Pilgrimage, is pilgrimage to Mecca at other times of the year. The Kaaba is the central shrine in Mecca and the Great Mosque, which is believed by Muslims to have been built by Abraham and his son Ishmael. Pilgrims to Mecca wear simple clothing of white cloth, which denotes ritual purification. There are many different rites of the pilgrimage. So it begins with circumambulation, or walking in a circle around the Kaaba, and then running 7 times between 2 hills, which recalls the plight of Hagar and her son Ishmael before drinking water from the Zamzam well. So Muslims have their own version of the story of Abraham, Ishmael, and Ishmael's mother Hagar. According to the Muslim tradition, it was Ishmael, not Abraham's son Isaac, who is the ancestor of the Jews, but rather Ishmael, the ancestor of the Arabs, who inherited the covenant from Abraham. between Abraham and God. The next step of the pilgrimage is to journey a few miles to Mount Arafat, and then there's standing from midday to sunset in meditation before God. Then there's a return journey to Mecca with an overnight stop at Muzdalifa, where each pilgrim gathers pebbles. The following day, pilgrims then throw their pebbles at 3 stone pillars in the village of Mina, which commemorates moments in the life of Abraham when he was able to resist temptations from Satan, who's called Iblis in Islam. Pilgrims then sacrifice sheep or camels to commemorate Abraham's submission or Islam to God's command to sacrifice his son Ishmael. And then there's the Feast of the Slaughter. This brings the Hajj to an end, and it's also celebrated by all Muslims around the world. The Islamic calendar is called the Hijri calendar. It reckons years from the migration to Medina. These are the years of the Hijra, or migration. It's a lunar calendar, and the year is only 354 days long. The number of days of each month is adjusted based on the actual cycle of the moon, with each month beginning about 2 days after the new moon. And the year begins on the first day of the month of Muharram. And finally, a bit about the role of women and men in Islam. The Quran says to protect and support widows and orphans. In ancient Arabian society at the time of Muhammad, widows didn't often have a lot of support or protection because their husband had died, and they were often regarded as undesirable for remarriage because they had children from another man associated with them. So orphans were also in a similar position. But the Quran is very clear that Muslims should protect widows and orphans. Muhammad himself married many widows in order to help give support for them and their children from a previous marriage. The Quran does teach the spiritual equality of men and women. For example, Surah 3, verse 195, it says, quote, "I will deny no man or woman among you the reward of their labors," unquote. On the other hand, there are different laws and rules that apply for women and men. Women in Islam are expected to wear hijab, or covering for modesty, although it's interpreted quite differently by different Muslim sects and cultures. In Islam, men are allowed to practice polygamy. They're allowed to have up to 4 wives, although women are only allowed to have maximum 1 husband. Muhammad himself had more than 4 wives, 11. And then also in Islam, as mentioned previously, it's believed that the afterlife is different for men and women because Muslim men who make it to heaven or paradise are rewarded with many virgins or maidens that they can have sexual intercourse with, whereas there's no corresponding reward for women. There are also different views about the role of women in Islam between more traditional or fundamentalist Muslims, including Islamists or those who believe in political Islam, versus various types of modernizers or reformers who have been influenced by Western ideologies such as liberalism or democracy to various degrees. The picture on the slide is of some Muslim women in Iran wearing the khador, which is one interpretation of the hijab or requirements for Muslim veiling. And now we're going to talk about the history of Islam in the modern period, essentially the last couple of centuries. So there were various responses of Muslim nations to the rise of Western powers in the 18th and 19th centuries. Previous to that, the Ottoman Empire was more powerful than any European empire and continued to advance into Europe for many centuries. But eventually, the Ottomans started to stagnate, technologically at least, and they were gradually pushed back and challenged by the Europeans. So this continued in the 18th and 19th centuries for the various Muslim dynasties, including, for example, the Safavid dynasty of Iran and the Mughal dynasty of India, which was gradually conquered by the British, essentially. In the 1800s and early 1900s, Britain, France, and other European nations took control of large parts of the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim nations. And this continued into the 20th century after the First World War, which ended in 1918. The Ottoman Empire fought on the side of the losing powers of the First World War, and so they had many of their territories carved up and taken away by Britain and France. Islam, however, the religion remained quite strong throughout the period of European domination, and there were many Sunni revival movements. Shah Wali Allah, who lived from 1702 to 1762, was an Indian Sufi who lived in Delhi, India. He regarded Sunni Islam as a single unified tradition. He believed in following Sharia, or traditional Muslim law, but he also believed in unifying the Hanafi and Shafi'i schools of jurisprudence. Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab lived from 1703 to 1792. He was an Arab and the founder of the tradition known as Wahhabism, which is still very influential today in the nation of Saudi Arabia and elsewhere among some Sunni Muslims. He advocated a return to the Quran and the Hadith to make new legal rulings, or ijtihad, rather than blindly following the rulings of later medieval jurists, or taqlid. He also emphasized the transcendence of the unknowable God. So he advocated a very distinct form of Sunni Islam, although it is the state ideology still practiced in Saudi Arabia today. You can see the picture on the slide, the gradual evolution of the Saudi state. It started just as a tiny part of the Arabian Peninsula, but eventually conquered a lot of Arabia and took over after the decline of the Ottomans. A bit more about the later history of Sharia in the Ottoman Empire itself. So Sharia began to be replaced by modern codes of law in the 19th century. In the 1850s and 1860s, the Ottoman Empire abolished much of Sharia and replaced it with new legal codes. They were essentially trying to modernize and reform their legal system, in large part inspired by Western European models. There was a commercial code, a penal code, a code of commercial procedure, and a code of maritime commerce, and these were based on the French legal system of the time. There's also Majalla, or the law of contracts, torts, etc. This was completed in 1876. It was largely based on the rulings of Sunni jurists that were approved by the Hanafi school of Sunni jurisprudence. The Majalla was the first modern legal code promulgated by a state and administered in secular courts that was, however, based on Sharia. And then in terms of the family law in the Ottoman Empire, they continued to apply Sharia. In 1915, the Sultan, that was the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, issued 2 imperial decrees, one permitting wives to request a dissolution of marriage in certain circumstances approved by the Sunni Sharia, or law. And then in 1917, the Ottoman law of family rights extended these principles. By the way, the picture on the slide is of the Ottoman Empire as it existed in the year 1875. Although there were degrees of control over different parts of the empire, by then some parts had already essentially fallen under the sway of foreign powers, such as Britain having control and influence over Egypt, for example. There were also modernizers in the Muslim world in the 1800s. Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who lived from 1817 to 1898, was a Muslim nationalist in India. He advocated splitting India, which at the time was a colony of Britain, into 2 separate independent states, one majority Muslim and the other majority Hindu. This eventually happened. So when India was granted independence from Britain after World War II, it was divided into the Muslim majority Pakistan and the Hindu majority India. And there was also, unfortunately, many religious conflicts between Hindus and Muslims in India at that time. Muhammad Abduh, who lived from 1845 to 1905, was an Islamic scholar and the Grand Mufti, basically a very high official in the jurisprudence of Islam of Egypt. So he was a prominent figure in the Nahda, or Arab Enlightenment. His ideology is described as Islamic modernism. He attempted to reconcile Islam with modern Western science and politics, whereas other Muslims were more just fundamentalists or traditionalists. An overview of modern Muslim nations as they existed in the 19th and 20th centuries. In terms of education, the Ottoman Empire and then its successor state, the Republic of Turkey, and European colonies in Muslim lands adopted Western secular education systems. But traditional Muslim education systems focusing on madrasas or Islamic schools also remained. The madrasas focused on Quran and similar studies such as Sharia. In terms of politics, Muslim nations gained independence from European powers after World War II ended in 1945. So parts that had been dominated by Britain, like Egypt, or by France, like Syria, these became independent nations. Others, like in North Africa, had to gain independence in the decades that followed, such as Algeria fighting a war against France for its independence, which it eventually won. In terms of economics, oil was discovered in many Muslim nations in the Middle East in the 20th century, and many of these nations became quite wealthy and powerful because of their oil reserves, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in the Persian Gulf. In terms of religiosity, Islamic fundamentalism has been on the rise in the Middle East and North Africa since at least the mid-1900s. So modernization and secularization did not proceed as much in the Muslim world as it has in the Western world. Although many Muslim nations became less secular, more religious, and less Western in the 20th century, bucking the trend of a lot of the other Western and developing world. However, in the last few decades, this itself has started to change. There has been a decline in religious participation in at least some Muslim nations, like in Iran, in recent decades. And a bit about political Islam or Islamism. Abu al-Ala Maudadi, who lived from 1903 to 1979, was an Indian or Pakistani Muslim, and he advocated making Pakistan an Islamic state using traditional Islamic law or Sharia. It did not happen exactly that way, but Islamism is still very influential politically and religiously in Pakistan. Sayyid Qutb, who lived from 1906 to 1966, advocated for an Islamic government or political Islam. He greatly opposed the United States and Western culture. He was from Egypt and influenced the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood. So his ideology is called Salafi jihadism, which seeks to establish a global caliphate through conquest of non-Muslim nations. Ayatollah Khomeini lived from 1900 to 1989. He was from Iran. He led the Islamic Revolution in Iran against the US-backed Shah, or King of Iran. He founded an Islamic Republic. It had a Shia Muslim government specifically. And a bit about Sharia today around the Muslim world. First, going back to British India, this had formerly been ruled by the Muslim Mughal Empire, but once it became ruled by Britain and became part of the British Empire, there were secular legal codes developed based on English common law. However, the secular law and the family law of different religious communities were administered by the same courts. There were different religious laws governing communities of different religions. So the Hindus had their own legal code, the Muslims had their own legal code, and so on. This co-administration of different codes of law, some of them secular, some of them religious, by the same courts, influenced the later legal systems of India and Pakistan. Sharia continues to have influence today. Most Muslim nations do have secular legal codes, but the family law which remains is often based on Sharia, although it may be in a modern codified form. In recent times, civil law codes have tended to incorporate some of the principles from Sharia, combining them with other laws. And some Muslim nations have introduced certain criminal sanctions and economic practices from Sharia due to an increase in Islamic fundamentalism in the 20th century. So you can see the map on the slide has a color-coded breakdown of the prevalence of Sharia in some different Muslim nations. The nations with legal codes based mainly on Sharia at the state or national level include Iran, Oman, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Nations with Sharia mixed with other systems at the national level include Afghanistan, Djibouti, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Mauritania, Malaysia, Pakistan, Syria, and Tunisia. And there are also some Muslim nations that have Sharia at the regional level, including Bangladesh, Nigeria, Somalia, and Sudan. In the case of Nigeria, it's not a majority Muslim nation. They also have many Christians, but at the regional level, majority Muslim regions have Sharia. And then there are nations that have Sharia in the family law, including Algeria, Indonesia, Morocco, Philippines, and Thailand. Thailand is a majority Buddhist country, but they have a Muslim family law for Muslim communities who do live in Thailand. And so too with the Philippines, which is majority Christian. So that concludes our introduction to Islam. Next up is part 12, Sikhism. Until next time.